My name is Richard de Crespigny. I was a pilot in command of Qantas Flight 32 that had an engine failure over Singapore, putting the lives of 440 passengers and 29 crew at jeopardy. This is everything I'm authorised to tell you. There was an engine fire with the failure of the electrics, the hydraulics, pneumatics, brakes, slats. It was one after the other these failures came about. We call events like these a black swan event. I realised we were entering into something that I'd never experienced before, and it would challenge me and my crew to the edge of our limits. Qantas Flight 32 was a flight from Singapore to Sydney on the 4th November 2010. It was an Airbus A380. The start of it was just like any other flight. We were taxiing out from the terminal in Singapore to the runway. It was a perfect day to go flying, 30 degrees, clear skies, no wind. It was 4 minutes after takeoff when engine number 2 exploded. It was actually 2 explosions, like boom, boom. They were loud and certainly unexpected. The passengers in the back were unsure what was happening. The aircraft shook, and all of a sudden alarms started sounding. 40 alarms were queued up in the first second alone. It was really confusing. About 1 minute after that explosion, I made a pan call to air traffic control saying, pan, 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 Qantas 32 engine failure, maintaining 7,400 feet, maintaining a heading of such and such, stand by for instructions. So a pan message is a notification to air traffic control that we're about to say there is a problem and we're going to need priority. Other aircraft listening in the sky, if they hear a pan call, they go quiet so that they don't interrupt us. Air traffic control did stop talking to us until we were ready to talk to them. We tried to cancel the alarms, but they kept coming back because there were more checklists queued behind. So it was very distracting. The top panel was a sea of red lights. The center panel was a sea of red lights. Every time we started to action a checklist, it felt like there was a jackhammer pushing me down into the chair. After the first 30 seconds, I said to Matt, the first officer, my co-pilot, ECAM actions. Now, ECAM is the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. It's a computer program that monitors and sensors and parameters on the A380 that will say if things are wrong. Eventually, after about 3 minutes in proceeding away from Singapore, Matt stopped actioning the checklist and he said, could we please head back towards Singapore? And that was an excellent suggestion. So I told Matt to stop actioning the checklists. I got clearance and then we positioned to enter a holding pattern near Singapore Airport. So when I was flying and doing something different, Matt would have to monitor me. And when the aircraft was in stable flight, I would be monitoring Matt. As pilots, we try to maintain what we call a mental model of the airplane. It's a mapping of what state the airplane's in, and if something goes wrong, what we do about it. But that mental model was getting challenged as each successive checklist arrived to say that more parts were damaged. When you're overloaded by alarms and distractions, the amygdala in the brain can fire off the fear response, which is fight, flight, or freeze. This is not a good response if you're in charge of heavy, high-tech equipment. We have to try and avoid the fear response that would have us doing the wrong thing. We have to aviate, navigate, communicate, and then when the cortex in the slower part of our brain comes online to assess the situation, then we can assess the aircraft, keep our mental model, and work out the right actions to do. When we saw blank screens, data had crosses on it instead of numbers and symbols. So I knew that sensors had been blown off the aircraft. The level of damage was extensive on board QF32. We'd lost about 650 wires that were broken. We'd lost half our networks. Out of 22 systems on the aircraft, 21 were affected. Engine number 2 had exploded, and it created shrapnel like a cluster bomb. 400 pieces of shrapnel hit the aircraft. The only system not affected was the oxygen system, but we didn't need that because we were below 10,000 feet. So in every system, there was between moderate and extensive damage. The peak of stress for me during QF32 was about 15 minutes after the engine exploded. There were so many failures, and the failures had knock-on effects. So 2 failures might come together to make a third failure. It became very impossible to track not just the primary failures, but the knock-on effects, and I was overloaded. I'd lost my situational awareness for the aircraft and what we could do. But then a very strange thing happened, and I call that reversing the logic. Reversing the logic is not my idea. It was Gene Kranz at Houston, at NASA, in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the astronauts are going to the moon. During the Apollo 13 crisis, when the oxygen tank exploded, Gene Kranz stood up, saw that his mission controllers were overloaded, and he said, "Gentlemen, stop wondering about what's broken and focus on what's working." Instead of looking at the hundreds or thousands of failures, when you invert the logic, we just needed 2 wings. We just needed enough brakes to slow down. We needed enough flaps and slats and enough electrics just to get us flying. It was like we were doing a junkyard wars building of a basic aircraft from junk in a scrap heap. We didn't have sensors for the brakes, for brake temperatures, for hydraulic systems. And so a lot of the checklists that came up were incorrect. When the checklist came up to transfer fuel or to turn off critical hydraulics, we didn't just blindly follow the checklist. We looked at other synoptic systems on the aeroplane to see a second source of instrumentation to say, is this indication correct and does it make sense? There were many decisions we made that probably half the pilots in the world would disagree with. We stayed up in the air for 2 hours so that we could understand how the aircraft had been damaged and what we had left when we would come in to land. And so we did a dress rehearsal of the landing before we made our approach. We proved the aircraft safe to fly at 4,000 feet, slowed down with the flaps out. And again, that wasn't in any Airbus manual, it wasn't in my aircraft manual, but pilots are trained to study all the other emergencies out there so that if we meet them again, we can survive them. So the control check that we did before we landed was a critical part in the safety of the flight. Because as we came into land, we were receiving speed warnings and stall warnings. So many things had gone wrong. The aircraft has duplicated systems for redundancy. So if we lose one engine, we have spares. But in many systems, we were losing the primary and the secondary. There were no checklists for those cases, and we certainly haven't trained for them. I was uncertain whether the engines would stay flying. So I requested to climb in the holding pattern near Singapore. So if we lost all the engines, we could glide back to Singapore with no engines. And it takes about 15 years to get a pilot from off the street into the left-hand seat in command of a passenger jet. I had served in the Royal Australian Air Force for 11 years, and I had been flying in Qantas for another 24 years. And the military experience is exceptional for getting you used to flying aircraft to and beyond their limits. You actually lose control of the aircraft often when you do dogfights, and you have to recover. You have to push your aircraft to the limit. I think there are 2 types of pilots. One type of pilot doesn't have too much interest in the engines or maybe the deep mechanics. He just turns a switch and expects the engine to start, and that's all they need to know. I'm different. I have to know the aircraft from the ground up. If you really want to understand a system so that you can recover it if it's breaking, you have to know everything down to its base foundations. The preparation needed to be an airline pilot or to survive a crisis is intense. Standard operating procedures won't help you in a crisis because it's not a standard time. It's looking at all the threats, calculating the risks, and it's practicing the things that scare you. There are 40 million commercial flights every year around the world. And in a lot of those flights, things go wrong. So we're naturally solving problems and stopping crises. Pilots get lots of practices with emergencies. All pilots also receive extensive training in simulators. For my airline, we did 4 simulator trips every year, and a simulator taken to hell and back for 4 hours, where you practice things that are uncomfortable, they're difficult. Sometimes you don't action them correctly. So you go back, you have to adjust and retry, and you have to keep practicing these things that are difficult until you build habits. So you practice engine failures until they don't stress you. The crew of QF32 was an augmented crew. I was in command of the Airbus A380, and I would have 2 extra pilots as part of the normal crew. But on this day, this was an additional check as part of one of my 7 license renewals that we have to do every year as a pilot. So there were 2 additional captains on board, and their job were to check me to see if the flight went normally, to see if I looked after the aircraft, the passengers, obeyed air traffic control. This was called a route check. And one of the captains, David Evans, was actually training the other captain, Harry Wubben, to check me. The hierarchy of authority is quite different to what you would see in a business or a committee. We had 3 captains on board QF32 that day, 1 first officer and 1 second officer. I was the pilot in command, and even though there were 2 other captains on board, they would be supernumerary to me and they would support us. Many times during QF32, I said stop to the crew because there was something wrong. If you demand the right and the privilege to say stop to your team, then you must also give your team the right to say stop to you. And there were many times during QF32, the pilots in the cockpit said, stop. This is not right, or let's talk about it. This is not an abuse or a threat to the ego of the person in charge. This is everyone trying to add their ideas into the mix and get the best outcome. When I said ECAM actions, that gives the instruction to Matt to start actioning checklists. He now starts going head down, focusing on the screens, looking at the checklists, checking the systems, moving switches. I'm now flying the aeroplane and talking to air traffic control. We could have declared a mayday. You would issue a mayday if you think you're going to die. A mayday call received by air traffic control will say, shut down departures, get ready for 440 passengers to come to the operating theatres because this could get nasty. Although we were working to our limits or sometimes beyond, I was absolutely confident that as a team we would prove resilient. So we declared a PAN and it was never upgraded to a mayday. Every 5 minutes, we checked the fuel on board to make sure we had sufficient. And every 10 minutes, I queried the crew, should we just throw the aircraft on the ground or should we continue with the checklists? And everyone agreed we should continue with the checklists. I'm really proud to say that I think of the 100 decisions we made that day, they were all correct. And that's not because of me. It's because of the team of the 5 pilots pooling their knowledge, training, and experience and decision-making to come up with what I think were perfect decisions. If you thought it was stressful in the cockpit, now put yourself in the passengers' seats. They're looking out the window, they're seeing the wing open up, a bit of fire in the wing, they're seeing part of the wing fly past, they're seeing fuel and hydraulic oil streaming out the back of the wing. They're feeling the aircraft shaking like they're driving down a corrugated dirt road. And all the alarms are going off around them. The cabin service manager tried to contact us in the cockpit. He couldn't because the intercom had been destroyed by the explosion. So the only way we could have communication with the cabin was to send Mark, the second officer, back to give instructions face to face. Or I could press the public address button and send a message out to all the passengers and all the cabin crew, and we ended up doing that quite a lot. Pilots find it very amusing to watch movies about air disasters because none of it is really based in facts. I think the movie Die Hard had a picture of an aircraft taking off, someone lit a match of fuel on the ground and it chased the aircraft and moved into the air. That just doesn't happen. Really, only 2 or 3 aircraft out of 40 million are crashing. The aviation safety record is just the most phenomenally remarkable safety record. There is nothing that closely matches it. But I don't think people realise just how often pilots have to correct the system. There's been fuel, there's catering, there's engineering. Sewage systems are emptied on the aircraft. The cabin crew have to come together. All these systems have to be amalgamated to get all these people to come onto the aircraft and leave on schedule. And things go wrong all the time. And what passengers don't realise is that when everything's perfect, The technical crew or the pilots will operate the aircraft and you'll be safe. And when things go wrong, it might be an engineering problem or dirty fuel, or a passenger hasn't boarded the aircraft. These are the things the pilots fix all the time. At the end of the QF32 incident, I debriefed the passengers saying what had happened, why, what was about to happen, what they needed to do. And I told them that the engines only fail 1 in every 350,000 engine hours. That means that only one pilot in 4 of a 4-engine aircraft will ever see an engine failure in their whole career. There are other types of failures too. There could be fuel problems or hydraulic problems or weather problems. But really, I would say you wouldn't have a major problem coming up any more than 1 in 100 flights. Even though I've retired from aviation, I think our lives are in the best hands possible, and I have the highest respect for everyone who commands a big jet in the sky. Pilots are always empathetic and compassionate, and we always try and help people who say they have a fear of flying. So the best thing you can do if you have a fear of flying when getting onto an aircraft is to tell people, tell the cabin crew, and they will try and help you. And during my time flying on the A380, I would walk around the cabin during the cruise on my time off, and if people had a fear of flying that they were happy to discuss, I would take them for a walk around the aircraft for 2 hours, and I could fix their fear of flying in 2 hours. The Airbus A380 has 4 million parts. It's worth $400 million US. It was one part of the A380, a little stub pipe about this long. It had been manufactured incorrectly, and one side of the pipe's wall was thinner than the other. And with vibration, that thin side of the wall cracked. So when that stub pipe fractured, oil bled into a part of the engine that should not be on fire. It got hot, it caught fire, it weakened the hub for the intermediate turbine. The turbine ripped itself off the shaft, oversped and exploded. Pieces came off that disc at 2.5 times the speed of sound. It's called a rotor burst. When the engineers determined the cause of the failure on board QF32, engineers around the world inspected all the Airbus A380s that had the Rolls-Royce engines. And they found about another 20 engines that had faulty produced stub pipes. So those engines were pulled off and the stub pipes changed. As a consequence of the failure, there are now checks made where you can use cameras to look at these stub pipes and make sure that they're safe, but also the engine has been changed so that these failures are not expected to happen again. While we were in the air, I knew that the crisis centre in Qantas would have been convened, and it had. And there were people amassing in a room of all backgrounds, political, mechanical, financial, and they're all there to add value and to solve the problem. Now, they couldn't talk to us because the satellite phone on board our aircraft, well, 2 of them have been destroyed. People in the crisis centre trusted the pilots in the flight deck of QF32 to get that aircraft down on the ground. And in the flight deck, we trusted the people in the crisis centre to prepare for our arrival. When we landed, we stopped about 100 metres short of the end of the 4-kilometre-long runway. 8 fire trucks surrounded us, ambulances, police, triage. Like layers of an onion, fuel was gushing out of the wings when we were sitting on the runway, faster than it was gushing out of the wings when we were in flight. Passengers looked outside the window and noticed that there were no fire services approaching the aircraft. What they didn't realise is, in the cockpit, Matt was saying to the fire services, put foam over the fuel that's gushing on the ground, put water over the hot brakes to cool them down. The fire services said, well, turn off your engines first. We said, we have. They said, no, you haven't. I put my head out the window and I noticed that even after using 3 devices to try and shut down engine number 1, that engine number 1 was still turning on the outside. We had an uncontrolled engine that we couldn't shut down. People criticise perhaps the decisions to keep passengers on board. In fact, some of the pilots think it was more dangerous on the ground than it was in the air. We were on the ground for 2 hours before the last passenger got off the aircraft. There were so many threats outside that it was safer on board the aircraft than outside. There was fuel gushing around the aircraft, 4 tons on the ground. If passengers walked through the fuel, they might put a spark that would ignite the fuel. They might walk in front of engine number 1 that's still running and get sucked into it. They might get covered in foam from the 8 fire trucks. I had done studies of passenger evacuations, and I knew that passengers will get injured in an evacuation. And bearing in mind that the doors of an A380 are higher than the doors on any other aircraft in the sky. If we put your grandfather down the slide, and maybe he used a wheelchair to get on the aircraft, but now he's going down a 45-degree slide down through 8 meters onto a hot concrete runway. If he doesn't break his legs when he touches the runway, maybe someone will concertina enter him and break his hip. So there was massive risk in just evacuating down the slides. We used stairs for people to go down the stairs to get off the aircraft. The other part of the disembarkation of the aircraft that I'm particularly proud about is the management of the passengers and their onboard luggage. Michael Von Reith, the customer service manager, he made a public address that everyone was to leave the luggage in the overhead lockers, and it was critical they did it. Everyone complied except one person who came to the front door with his stroller bag. And Michael said, "I told you not to bring your stroller." And the man said, "Well, I'm here at the door. What are you going to do about it?" Michael picked up the hand luggage and threw it across the aircraft and said, "Get off this aircraft." No one disobeyed any of the cabin crew's instructions. Everyone got off in an orderly way and there was no injury. In Russia, about 10 years ago, a superjet crashed on the runway and passengers died because other passengers congested the aisles with cabin luggage before they got off. We've seen the JAL flight in Japan recently, where all the passengers left their luggage in the overhead lockers and the evacuation went perfectly. I told the passengers that because of the statistics, them having seen this engine failure probably reduces the likelihood of their neighbours or family ever seeing an engine failure. Now, after we landed, the CEO of Qantas asked the chief engineer, "Can you be sure that the failure that's happened aboard QF32, can you be sure that it won't happen again?" The engineer said no. And so the CEO made a brave decision to say that I'm now grounding all the A380s in the airline, wherever they are in the world. In Qantas, they found some more engines that did have the failure, but they never took off. When you find yourself in a crisis, the body reacts with cortisol that floods the blood. I had a cortical high during the QF32 event and for the following 2 days until I arrived home in Sydney. And now I found myself with a body that was totally depleted of energy, and I then went into a state of post-traumatic stress. I wasn't listening to anyone. I was going through a stage of looking at the what ifs. Could I have done something better? Maybe I did something wrong. So what if I had tried all these different things? And when I slept, the incident kept circulating in my mind. I would dream about QF32 for the 2 hours in the air, 2 hours on the ground. And when that stopped, I would then cycle back and start it again. But I sought psychological help. I went to a psychologist 3 times. I grounded myself to the chief pilot, saying, "I'm not in a position to evaluate if I'm safe to fly, which means you must ground me." And he said, "Thank you." Now, not all the pilots did the same. Some pilots thought they could persist. Some pilots had a lot of trouble with post-traumatic stress. It took a long time to cure. In my case, I had mine solved within 4 months and I went back flying. Mental health is a very serious problem in aviation, but it's no more serious than anywhere else in the community. Well, we have to give people the psychological safety to say, "You know what, I'm not okay and I need a week off." Now, the problem in aviation was, yes, you could always say you need a week off and the airline would happily have you on the ground. But when you self-declare like that, the process to get back in the air is so enormous by the regulators that the consequence is the people that simply don't declare that they're unfit to fly because of mental trauma. Now, in America, there was recently the Mental Health in Aviation Act of 2025, and this is going a long way towards trying to get both companies and the regulators, which is the FAA in America, to change the system to try and get pilots back in the air quicker once the pilots say they're fit to fly. What you have to restore is trust, because at the moment there is no trust between the pilots and the medical inspectors in aviation. Trust takes years to build and it can be destroyed in a second. So this act in the American government is a very good step. Whether we like it or not, automation is here and it's going to control our lives more every day. In aircraft, the automation now consists of autopilots, auto thrust, navigation systems, you name it. There's probably 1,000 computers on an Airbus A380. The problem is with the automation, we are more of a servant to the box. You can't fix it, so either you have to turn it off or you have to find a way to work around it. And that is a problem for pilots. So automation presents more problems for pilots, not less, because we have to be able to identify a faulty computer system and know how to turn it off. The world is suffering its greatest pilot shortage ever. Aviation's been growing, but the number of pilots coming into the profession is not increasing. To some degree, it's caused by the low-cost airlines where people are expecting to fly for almost no money across the country. And so the income's less, the pilot salaries are going down, and young people are deciding that maybe a career as a pilot won't support them for their life. So all the lead times are great, and airlines need to be proactive, not reactive, and they just simply have to give the incentives to have pilots commit to a career in aviation. People ask me if I think that aviation is getting safer or not. When only 2 or 3 out of 40 million aircraft crash in a year, it's hard to imagine how you can really get much safer. I mean, the chance of getting on one of those aircraft is less than the chance of winning the best lottery in America. So aviation is so safe already. Now, we can't take that for granted. Pilots have to keep their skills up, their manual flying skills, in case the automation fails. AI, as it stands today, is not threatening pilots in the cockpit. AI is a tool, it's not a replacement. So until we see sentient computers, which are computers that have thought, awareness, consciousness, and prediction, until we see sentient computers in the workplace, there will be pilots in aircraft, and those pilots will save aircraft every day from minor and major disasters, and the passengers will continue to be safe. People make very extreme conclusions about safety when they're talking about companies like Boeing and Airbus. Pick the airline that you trust, and airlines are different, and you can be comfortable that you will get to destination. Now, I have been hard on Boeing because I think the board of Boeing has lost the principles or the values of what Boeing was. Boeing has been around since the Second World War, and Bill Boeing started a company which was an engineering company. Boeing was an engineering company that built aircraft. The problem was they lost the focus on the technology. They lost the focus to have constructive destruction, to get rid of old things and bring in new. The 737's been flying since 1967. So when they do updates to that aircraft, it's like getting an old 1960s Mustang and saying, well, let's turn it into an F1 racing car. There should be constructive destruction. You should always get rid of the old to make way for the new, because the technology is now totally different with fly-by-wire. And really, to fit an old aircraft with fly-by-wire is sort of incompatible. The term fly-by-wire. It's really rather simple. Let's start with the non-fly-by-wire machines, which is what we've always had. Everything's mechanical. It's a bit like the tractor in your field. You turn the steering wheel, you can see all the bell cranks and the axles and the shafts turning to make the wheels turn. When you get to fly-by-wire, you take out that connection between the steering wheel, for example, and the wheels, and you put a sensor in the steering wheel to detect what position it's in, and then computers will move the wheels with actuators for the steering. So now you've got electronics and computers and actuators to do that link between what you're commanding and what happens at the back end. And now the modern aircraft are all fly-by-wire because they're easier to design, they're easier to build, they're easier to maintain, and they actually perform better, lifting bigger weights or doing more action. Boeing, of course, is now making fly-by-wire aircraft. The 787 is a good aircraft, the 777 will be a great aircraft, and Boeing will recover. You see, the thing is, sometimes if you're the leader in a high-tech industry, the last thing you do is listen to your customer, because your customer doesn't know what they want. The leading-edge companies don't listen to the customers. They produce what the technology lets them produce and let the customers see how they apply it. This is what Airbus did. And so they built this fleet of fly-by-wire aircraft, and they're doing very well. And Airbus has kept a focus on being an engineering company and producing the best designs they can. I've seen many articles saying that turbulence is getting more frequent and more severe. I think the problem is that there's more congestion in the airspace and more aircraft in the sky, and maybe aircraft can't divert to miss bad weather because there's another aircraft in that part of the sky. Aircraft are being pushed as close together as they can possibly get. So I think it's just there's more aircraft in the sky and there's more people hitting turbulence events. I was planning to fly until I turned 65 years of age, at which point the regulations state that I can't fly internationally. So I was planning to retire at 65, but another black swan hit, COVID. Who was expecting that? So in 2020, aviation came to a standstill. Pilots were retrenched. And I found myself again put under stress. And I walked home to my wife, Coral, and said, I don't have a job anymore. And she said, we have just written a book about resilience. Now it's time to put it into practice again. So this is the reality. You know, you have to expect in this world of change and disruption. My life changed after QF32. I'm touring the world, presenting to companies and organizations around the world about resilience. So I've just started a podcast called Fly, The Elements of Resilience, about personal, corporate, national, and even existential resilience. And I'm interviewing the most remarkable people from around the world. You have to be comfortable being uncomfortable. This is all about building confidence and courage. You know, anxiety and resilience are on the opposite ends of the spectrum. So when we see our Gen Z people, the young kids today who are anxious, it's even called the anxious generation, we need to transition them through confidence, courage, to be intrepid people, taking risks, making change, and surviving. Yes, my life will continue changing. I'll have to keep adapting or I will surely perish. And that's what all of us must have a responsibility to do.
Hi, I'm a producer and Authorized account. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe and comment with more topics that you'd like us to cover in this series.